I can still remember that morning with painful clarity, the way sunlight slid through the glass on the 27th floor of Westbridge Analytics and washed over the desk that had carried me through 14 years. Every detail in that room felt as familiar as my own skin, from the keyboard with the worn-out S key from years of running simulations to the small photo of my mother in a wooden frame beside my monitor. And yet less than 1 minute was all it took for a single meeting to tear me away from all of it. Connor Drake, the new chief financial officer, walked into my office with the swagger of a man who believed he'd been sent to purify the entire world. Mid-30s, cold face, a voice so flat it sounded like he was reading a budget report to Congress. I had never met someone whose mere tone could knock the air out of a room until that day. He didn't sit, he didn't introduce himself, he didn't even pretend to have a conversation. He just stood beside my desk and said the company needed to streamline, to eliminate anyone who no longer fit the new direction. I hadn't even processed who he meant before he laid a paper in front of me and told me to sign my termination. In 30 seconds, Connor labeled me a legacy cost, a burden from the past. Dead weight, sis lowering the company down. 14 years of work, 14 years of late-night modeling, of saving the company from data shortages, of pulling Westbridge back from financial cliffs, reduced to two weightless words. Legacy cost. I didn't react, partly because the absurdity hit me like a slap, partly because I'd grown used to this new breed of leadership, people who thought anything older than last quarter deserved to be erased. I simply stood, looked at Connor for a few seconds, and nodded. I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me shaken. I opened my drawer and picked up a few personal things: the fountain pen I bought the day I became a senior analyst, the little photo of my mother and sister, and the personal laptop I used during peak workloads. I said nothing. I set my badge on the desk and walked out. As I passed through the hallway, a colleague glanced at me, worry in their eyes. I offered a small smile to calm them, even though something inside me was wound tight enough to snap. The elevator fell floor by floor, pulling me away from a life I'd built with both hands. When the doors opened on the ground level, my feet felt heavier. Westbridge wasn't just a workplace to me, it was where I built the Helios engine, the strategic forecasting system the entire company relied on. From the days when it was nothing more than a fragile experiment, just a few lines of code, to the moment it became the backbone tool that helped major corporations anticipate market swings. I had poured my youth, my ambition, my everything into it. No one at Westbridge understood Helios Engine the way I did, and no one ever asked what I needed to make it better. I left the lobby and stepped into the parking lot. Morning air was cool, but my throat felt dry, not because of being fired. What tightened my chest was the thought of my mother. She's undergoing heart treatment, and the medication is expensive. My sister is in her final year of college and still needs support. I am the sole provider. 1 month unemployed could shift everything into dangerous territory. My mother didn't know I'd been fired. She believed I had a steady, secure career. If she found out, she wouldn't sleep. I drove home in a fog, thoughts tangled like frayed wires. The whole way, I kept wondering if I had done something wrong. Should I have pushed human resources harder about the workload, asked for someone to train under me, promoted myself the way others did? But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. Connor didn't fire me because I underperformed. He fired me because he had no idea what I actually did and didn't care to know. He wanted to display power, and nothing screams authority like removing someone who looks too tied to the old era. When I walked into the house, my mother was sitting at the table with a cup of tea. She looked up and asked why I was home early. I told her it was just a light meeting today. I avoided her eyes because I was afraid she'd read the truth in mine. I couldn't let her worry. She needed calm, not fear. That night, I opened my personal laptop and checked the logs of the Helios engine. I didn't sign into the company system. I only reviewed the synced backup I had used for testing. That was when I saw the early signs: a privilege error access, a small internal warning, a single log line reminding me that the deep lock protocol would activate in 48 hours if it didn't receive biometric confirmation from the original architect. I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and exhaled. I didn't need revenge. I'm not that kind of person. But Connor had already set his own ending in motion, the natural ending for anyone who believes authority can replace competence. All I had to do was stay silent. Helios Engine would speak for me. The next morning, while I was making breakfast for my mother and trying to convince myself that things would somehow be fine, my phone buzzed. It wasn't a familiar number. It wasn't a bank message or a hospital reminder. It was an automated alert from the system I had lived with for more than a decade. The Helios engine had detected a new access attempt. I knew instantly who was trying to get in. Connor was probably preparing for his first board meeting since stepping in as chief financial officer. A debut meeting for a finance chief is always critical. Every eye on the board watches for the clarity of the presentation, the depth of understanding, and the precision of the forecasts. And Connor was not the kind of man who would walk into that room without something dramatic to show. He would want a flawless projection, sharp enough to convince the board he had everything under control. The problem was simple. He had just fired the only person who could give him that projection. I opened my backup copy. Of course, I didn't access the company system. I only checked the auto-synced logs the Helios engine sent to my personal machine whenever I tuned the model or ran independent tests. It was the copy I used to verify the system's behavior. It broke no security rules and only showed basic signals. The first line on the screen made me exhale. Access attempt failed. Verification needed. Authorized. Architect, Ava Lindstrom. I could picture Connor's face in that moment, baffled and irritated. A man convinced that his title came with unlimited authority, stopped cold by a single line of text. Not challenged by a person, but by a system he had never bothered to spend even 1 hour understanding. I set my teacup down and watched the next stream of data. Connor tried again and again. Each failure triggered a soft alert. I knew the type of man he was. He would never tolerate anything that stood in his way, especially a system he believed was just some dusty relic from the analytics department. I could almost map out his next steps. After the third failure, he had surely called the information technology team into his office and ordered a bypass. I had worked with that team for years. They were not incompetent, but they didn't understand the Helios engine the way I did. I raised it from a rough prototype. Every algorithm layer, every data intake module, every self-defense mechanism was born from crisis after crisis. I never built it to be exploited, and I never wrote it so someone could simply flip switches and force it open. When the logs showed the information technology team probing deeper, I knew they had reached the first security layer. That layer was designed to report errors, not collapse. They must have realized instantly that this wasn't an enterprise resource planning platform or a standard accounting tool. The Helios engine had 3 traits that most systems didn't have. First, multiple security layers based on behavioral data rather than simple passwords. Second, the ability to self-learn and assess risks in real time. Third, a nature that could not be instantly handed over because it ran on 14 years of accumulated judgment, not a document. A few minutes later, a warning surfaced. Unauthorized bypass attempt detected. Warning level 1. I pressed my fingertips to my forehead, wondering how everything was unfolding exactly the way I'd expected. Connor was surely standing inside the information technology room or pacing in front of a video call, ordering them to quickly fix the situation. I knew his nature. He hated complexity. He hated anything outside his control. And he would not believe the information technology staff when they told him this was a system that required time to understand. More logs streamed in. A supply chain report had tried to enter the system before being blocked. Market demand forecasts were drifting by 12%. For a company like Westbridge, 12% wasn't a minor error. It could freeze a major client's orders or halt production entirely. It was the direct consequence of the Helios engine failing to update its models. Less than 1 hour later, a major client notification hit the system. Unilever requires an updated quarter forecast within this week. Failure to deliver will pause the $180 million contract. I leaned closer to the screen. Unilever was one of Westbridge's largest accounts. A $180 million contract was not something any executive could treat lightly. I knew this would set off alarms, And I also knew Connor would try to hide it from the board at least until the meeting started. I shut the screen. In my mind, I saw my mother in the living room, reminding me to schedule her checkup. My sister texted last night that her dorm fees had been raised. Both are relying on me. And I had just been fired by a man who never understood what I truly brought to that company. But instead of the fear I'd felt the night before, something else settled in my chest. Something calm, something certain. The chaos was only beginning. Not because I wanted it, not because I pushed anything, but because the Helios engine's protection protocols were doing exactly what they were designed to do. I didn't need to interfere. I didn't need to sabotage anything. I didn't need to become the villain in this story. Reality would speak for me. And when the time came, they would finally understand who truly knew how the world they were trying to control actually worked. That afternoon, barely 2 hours after the alert from the major client, another wave of unusual logs appeared in the system. The urgency of the activity said everything. Connor was panicking, and he had begun doing exactly what a man who doesn't understand a system does when cornered. He called an emergency meeting with the information technology team and the related departments. I wasn't there, but I had been at Westbridge long enough to picture it clearly. He would be standing in front of a whiteboard, pointing at frozen charts, voice cold but rushed. He would blame the old platform, call the Helios engine an outdated relic, and insist that the issue wasn't how he managed it, but how the system was built. Reading those blame-shifting comments through the logs made me both angry and quietly amused. The Helios engine wasn't created to decorate reports. It was a complex, company-specific machine built through the demands of multiple leadership eras. My job had always been maintenance and optimization, not dictating its existence. But from Connor's point of view, blaming someone who wasn't there to defend themselves was the easiest path. I saw an unfamiliar account appear. 2 minutes later, I understood. Connor had hired an external consultant, someone brought in as an independent expert to fix whatever he thought was broken. Westbridge had used this kind of consultant before. Skilled, yes, but skilled in enterprise resource planning and accounting systems. The Helios engine was nothing like those. 10 minutes later, the consultant's account generated a cascade of access errors. Then a line surfaced that made me press my lips together. External consultant note: unable to interpret core architecture. Recommendation: contact the original architect. I leaned back in my chair. Of course, no outsider could make sense of the layered structure of the Helios engine, especially the behavioral models I built using many years of real-world data. Data isn't just numbers, it has depth. Each model reflects multiple economic cycles. How could a consultant grasp all that in a few hours, when even internal staff needed months to understand a single module? When it became clear no one could help him, Connor turned to the final option I had always known he would use: fabricate a report. I saw logs showing that he had pulled old sample datasets from internal storage. Those files were never meant for real forecasting. The market shifts too quickly for them to stay relevant. But Connor didn't care. He extracted numbers, assembled charts, and tried to build something that looked complete. I couldn't see the report, but the logs told me enough. It was rushed. It was unsafe. And it would be disastrous if presented to the board. About 1 hour later, an internal meeting log appeared. A young analyst named Jaden accessed the new data set. I remembered him. Bright, dedicated, always questioning when something didn't make sense. He checked the numbers and asked directly in the meeting, why do this quarter's figures match last quarter exactly? No change, no movement, a perfect copy that made no logical sense. Connor's reaction showed up instantly in the logs. The typing pattern shifted, the tone in the notes sharpening. The internal notes captured him snapping, ordering everyone to stop doubting the data, warning that anyone questioning its validity was obstructing the company's progress. I could imagine Jaden turning pale. My chest tightened. He didn't deserve that, not for asking the right question. Then I saw the third override attempt. Connor was pushing deeper, trying to break through a higher security layer, maybe thinking that if the consultant couldn't solve it, he had to. I knew exactly what would happen if he kept going. The deep lock protocol existed to protect 12 years of accumulated behavioral intelligence. A bad override could force the system back to its base state. That meant losing all training data. That meant the Helios engine would be no smarter than a giant spreadsheet. A warning flashed. Danger level increased. Unauthorized, override attempt 3. Full model integrity at risk. I closed my eyes for a few seconds. I had never built the system to fight the company, but I also had never built it, so someone careless could destroy it. I worried for Westbridge, for the people who had trusted me for years, but I knew I couldn't call, couldn't text, couldn't step in. I had been removed, and returning now would only help Connor. And then I saw what I hoped I would never see. Connor ordered all warnings deleted. The log entries were flagged for removal. The information technology team refused, but one staff member was threatened with losing their job. Reading that line lit a fire in me. The only thing standing between the system and destruction was the decency of the people still trying to do the right thing. Finally, the deep lock protocol issued its highest alert. The system is entering protection mode in 12 hours. I stared at that line for a long time. Connor believed he could hide everything. He believed he could pressure people until they bent. But the system didn't bend for threats or arrogance. The Helios engine wasn't loyal to any person. It was loyal to the truth, and the truth was already putting everything back where it belonged. I went to bed later than usual, staring at the scrolling logs, as if the system were trying to tell me something. At dawn, before the sun fully rose, I opened my laptop again. New alerts filled the screen, denser than everything I had seen in the past days combined. From the very first line, I knew we had entered a different stage. Deep lock protocol activated. Access restricted. Only an authorized architect may unlock core modules. The Helios engine had officially locked every function that did not belong to me. It happened exactly the way I designed it. When the system detects 3 invalid override attempts and a threat of data manipulation, it shifts into deep protection mode. Every strategic dashboard goes blank. Forecast maps vanish. 12 months of automated reports become unreachable. Everything shuts down, like a sealed archive room that only the holder of the single key can enter. I watched the logs show a stream of failed access attempts from Connor, then dozens more from vice presidents desperate for data ahead of the board meeting. The entries came so fast, I could practically picture a floor full of people staring at white screens and error icons. Dashboard unavailable, forecast. Data missing. Request denied. I could almost hear the sighs, the scraping chairs, the coffee cups slammed down. They were not used to operating without forecasts. Westbridge relied on the Helios engine the way a body relies on a heartbeat. Without it, every major decision, every financial plan, every market strategy became invisible. Not long after that, the system logged an email from the major client. Short, but enough to keep an entire leadership floor awake. If we do not receive updated forecasting by Friday, the contract will be paused. Unilever had never used the word paused in 3 years of working with Westbridge. That word meant nearly frozen. And they didn't care about reasons. They wanted data. Whatever happened inside Westbridge was not their concern. Inside the logs, I saw Connor forward that email to the information technology team, demanding explanations. Then he scheduled a second emergency meeting within 24 hours. At that point, 12 hours remained before the board meeting. I couldn't hear that meeting, but the system notes helped me piece together the story. Connor asked questions nonstop, the behavioral notes capturing hints of raised volume and hard edges. He wanted to know why the dashboard would not load. Why was the system locked? Why was there no forecast for the board? Every question ended with the same accusatory tone. A new internal annotation appeared. The chief financial officer states the issue is from legacy design complexity. He blamed legacy complexity. One sentence that revealed everything about him. He did not try to understand the system. He did not ask why. He did not consider that he was tampering with a platform he had refused to listen to anyone about. Blame was simply the shortest road. But this time, the information technology team did not stay silent. I saw an internal email sent to the board and copied to the chief executive officer. It compiled every instance in which I had requested a successor to be trained for the Helios engine. I remembered each one clearly. I had asked at least 3 times. Once, early in the year, when the system was becoming more complex. Once, mid-year, I hoped to take an extended leave to care for my mother. And once more, when organizational changes began. All three requests were rejected for budget reasons or shifting priorities. The information technology team listed each message, each attachment, each managerial response, repeating the same line. The goal of the year was personnel cost savings. Boards rarely appreciate cost-saving decisions that turn into risk. I could imagine the air in the room as they read that chain of emails. No one wants to defend the person who cut costs at the price of jeopardizing a major contract. And even fewer want to defend the person who fired the system's only architect before the most critical meeting of the quarter. Soon after, a new legal notice appeared. Pending acquisition may be delayed due to missing quarter next models. Estimated deal value, $400 million, a $400 million acquisition. I remembered the weeks of meetings. Everything depended on next quarter behavioral forecasts. Without them, the deal halted. A halt meant losing leverage, losing market presence, losing the competitive edge. No one on the board would take that lightly. Connor's access attempts spiked. His typing speed increased so sharply that the system flagged it. He was trying to override again, despite all the warnings. My chest tightened when I saw the next entry. This was the fourth attempt. Danger level critical. Unauthorized. Override attempt 4. Model corruption imminent. The information technology team had to intervene. One of the senior engineers sent a notice refusing to override due to the risk of destroying 12 years of behavioral modeling. I knew him. He had worked with me years earlier. He understood that the system stood strong only because of the accumulated intelligence inside it. Wipe it out, and the Helios engine lost its soul. Connor grew furious. He demanded they proceed, threatening to reconsider their positions if they refused. But this time, the information technology team held their ground. They would not destroy what they also relied on every single day. Then the final line appeared, slowly, like the quiet end of a long storm. The system is entering protection mode in 12 hours. I sat in silence, staring at that message the way one watches a slow flame in a closed room. I understood exactly what it meant. Connor had pushed himself to the edge. The board was about to ask questions. The system was on the brink of sealing itself completely, and from this moment forward, every attempt to hide the truth would collapse. Chaos had reached its peak, and the circle of truth was about to close. The board meeting took place the next morning, exactly when the deep lock protocol had tightened every layer of access to the Helios engine. I was not there, but every log line, every timestamp, every internal signal flowing through the system let me witness it as if I were watching a movie whose ending I already knew. Only this time, the people inside that room were living the consequences for real. All senior executives were present. This was the most important meeting of the quarter, the one where the company finalized major investment decisions, budget allocations, and the merger strategy. I could picture the 30th floor boardroom glowing under white lights, the long, polished table, each seat occupied by one of the most powerful faces in Westbridge. The air must have been heavy, not only because the data was missing, but because the warnings from clients and partners had been piling up for days. When the meeting started, the large screen at the end of the room displayed the same line I had seen the night before. Access denied. Only primary architect authorized. No charts, no forecasts, no cash flow models. Nothing they had relied on as the foundation of every strategic decision. Just a cold blank space, like a reminder that any dependency without a backup always ends the same way, in chaos. Connor stood at the head of the table, remote in hand, trying to look composed as if all of it were part of his plan. The log showed he opened his first slide, a forecast patched together from outdated data. I had expected this. He could not build a new model, but he still wanted to show something, anything, to prove he had control. Barely 2 minutes passed before the system captured the first reaction. A board member, the vice president in charge of international markets, asked Connor why the chart did not reflect current economic conditions. The consumer growth numbers contradicted the government report released 2 days earlier. The revenue line moved opposite the entire industry trend. Variable costs stayed exactly the same. Those inconsistencies could not be hidden. People in that room were not the type to be fooled by a few bright colors and clean axes. They lived by data, by reading what others could not. By bringing old numbers into that meeting, Connor only dug himself deeper. The logs recorded a surge of queries, multiple voices asking at once why the data was out of date, why they could not load the dashboard themselves, why the system was locked, and who was responsible. Cornered, Connor had no choice but to admit he could not access the Helios engine. There was nowhere left to hide. Every eye in the room must have turned toward him, not immediately with anger, but trying to understand what the man who had just fired one of the company's core people thought he was about to say. The board called the information technology team into the room for clarification. I saw their activity spike in the logs. Within minutes, 2 members were summoned. The internal system captured their explanation plainly. The deep lock protocol could only be unlocked by biometric authentication from the primary architect, and that architect was Ava Lindstrom. I paused. Seeing my name appear in the system felt like hearing an echo from another life. My name rising in the center of a storm I was not part of, yet still the only person who could open or close that door. Right after that statement, an automatic chain of emails rippled between board members. Some expressed anger. Others questioned why there had been no contingency plan, no successor, no transition procedure. One board member asked a question so direct that the system saved it word for word. Who approved the termination of the sole architect of a 12-year-old system? I could picture Connor's face tightening. The logs showed a shift in his typing pattern, like his hands were shaking or he was trying to type fast enough to outrun the truth. He stumbled, blaming human resources for not giving him full information. Then they blame information technology for failing their duties. Finally, it is blamed on the system itself for being too complex and too hard to maintain. But none of that carried weight. When a system runs smoothly for 12 years and collapses only after the one person who understood it is removed, the problem is not the system. The problem is the decision. Then the logs captured several seconds of silence in the room. After that, the chief executive officer stood up without a word. The system described it as a moment of confusion, as if no one knew what he intended to do. Connor must have watched him, panicked. But no one tried to stop the chief executive officer. They let him walk out, closing the heavy door behind him. A short status line appeared in the system. The chief executive officer exited the boardroom. Action to be taken. Reading that, I knew the next phase would no longer belong to the system alone. Humans were about to face the truth they had spent 3 days avoiding. And the circle of this story was finally turning to the part I could no longer stay outside of. After the chief executive officer left the boardroom, the internal system went almost silent for a few minutes, like a lake settling after a stone has been thrown. But moments later, the logs came alive again, moving faster than anything I had ever seen. The pressure had gone beyond Connor's control, and now the weight was no longer on the system. It was on the highest levels of leadership at Westbridge. The first log appeared right after the chief executive officer walked out. Private meeting initiated. Participants: Chief Executive Officer, Head of Legal, Information Technology Director. I knew immediately that this meeting had never been on the schedule. It only happened when the company faced an existential threat. The information technology team submitted a technical summary confirming there was no way to access the Helios engine without my biometric authentication. They also outlined the risk of attempting another override, explaining that the system could not only lock, but also reset its internal structure if pushed too violently. Legal presented the list of contract clauses that would be violated if the quarter next forecast was not delivered on time. The numbers in that report made a chill run through me, even though I no longer worked there. It wasn't just Unilever. Another contract from a major tech group in Northern California had been sent a message. If forecasting is not delivered within 48 hours, we will take legal action for breach of contract. On top of that, an international logistics partner threatened to withdraw from a 3-year agreement. The compensation figures in that email reached tens of millions of dollars. The board could not ignore warnings like that. They were business people. They understood the price of delay in a technology project was higher than any investment cost. Meanwhile, Connor was unraveling. The log showed he tried to contact several former coworkers mine. He wanted them to persuade me to return, or at least give him temporary guidance. But one by one, they refused. One wrote in the log that they did not want to be involved in the current crisis. Another sent a direct note to Human Resources requesting to stay completely out of Connor's decisions. When he could not get through via colleagues, Connor turned to mid-level managers. Then my phone began to vibrate. First was a text from someone I used to work with in the data department. It was simple. Ava, are you doing all right? If possible, we need a quick favor. I stared at the screen for a long moment and turned it off. Not because I was angry, but because I knew they were being dragged into chaos that wasn't theirs. I didn't want anyone to become the messenger in this storm. But after that text came another from a regional finance lead, then another from the analytics director, all saying nearly the same thing. We appreciate your work. We hope you are okay. There are things only you understand. I did not reply, not out of coldness, but because I recognized Connor's strategy. He wanted to create the illusion that the company cared for me, that everyone wanted me back. But I also knew they didn't understand that I was fighting my own crisis. That afternoon, my mother collapsed and had to be taken back to the hospital. She fainted while walking around the house. I rushed her into the emergency room and waited in the hallway while the doctors checked her. Every minute felt heavier. The cost of treatment might double. The doctor said her condition needed close monitoring and constant medication adjustments. My younger sister called, voice trembling. I told her everything would be fine, even though I wasn't sure. Sitting under the harsh neon lights of the hospital hallway for the first time, I asked myself, should I return to Westbridge if they asked? Or should I find a new job, somewhere that actually values my work? I knew my worth in the market. A systems architect with long-term experience, with deep knowledge of behavioral forecasting, and a reputation for building stable data frameworks. But I also knew that rational thinking was becoming harder. My family needed stability right now, and Westbridge, despite its unfairness, was the only place where I could get that stability instantly. I got home after dark and opened my laptop to check the logs again. I saw the chief executive officer reviewing my file, a section of the internal system that no one had touched in years. There was a note I remembered clearly. Ava Lindstrom identified an internal fraud pattern and prevented major financial loss in fiscal year 5 years ago. I could still recall that day. I found a tiny breach in a data chain that was about to cause a massive financial leak. If I hadn't caught it, the company could have lost tens of millions. I never talked much about it because I never needed anyone to know. But now the chief executive officer was rereading what he had long forgotten. A moment later, I saw an email from the board to the chief executive officer. Call Ava. No procedure needed. This cannot wait. No formal words. No explanation. Just 3 lines, like a final order from the only people whose authority outranked Connor's. About 15 minutes later, my phone rang. A call, not a text, no name displayed. I stared at the screen for a moment before answering. There was silence on the other end, only heavy breathing. Then the chief executive officer spoke, his voice stripped of its usual calm, replaced with strain and exhaustion. Ava, we need you. Tell me your conditions. I closed my eyes. I had known this moment would come. And I also knew I was no longer the one who had been fired. I was the one they could not replace. I did not answer the chief executive officer right away. I let the silence stretch for a few seconds, not to appear powerful, but to quiet everything crashing inside my mind. Family pressure, the injustice of the past days, the chaos the company had brought upon itself, and the responsibility tied to the Helios engine I had built for more than a decade. When I finally spoke, my voice was steadier than I expected. I will return, but I have conditions. The chief executive officer almost immediately said he wanted to hear all of them. I made it clear that every agreement had to be presented in an official meeting with the full board and legal counsel present. No more private calls, no more internal side conversations. I would not come back through a blurred doorway, and I would not be used as a temporary fix. I would only return if my role was acknowledged for what it truly was. Within an hour of that call, Westbridge sent an official meeting request with confirmation that the entire board and legal would attend. I did not rush. I spent the evening deciding exactly what conditions I needed. I was not seeking revenge. I simply needed to ensure I would never again stand in a place where my work could be dismissed. The next morning, I arrived at headquarters. I did not bring a cardboard box or any old belongings. It was just me, my laptop, and a calmness I had not felt in days. As I crossed the lobby, a few employees looked at me as if I had become the story running through the entire building. Some nodded, some only watched, but their eyes held the same mix of curiosity, relief, and something close to respect. I entered the largest conference room in the company. The board was already seated. Legal waited at one end of the table. Connor sat across from them, looking like he had not slept for several nights. The chief executive officer rose when I walked in. No one spoke for a few seconds, as if the entire room were measuring my return. I pulled out a chair, sat down, and opened my laptop. Before we discuss my conditions, I want you to understand exactly what I bring. I connected my laptop to the screen. The Helios engine unfolded layer by layer, from its raw data foundation to the behavioral modeling tier, then to the predictive AI layer. I walked them through how the system learned over time and why it could not be transferred in a short meeting. I showed the sections of code I wrote during the company's financial crisis, the algorithms I added 5 years ago when I stopped a fraud incident, and the protective modules designed to defend against improper tampering. The room fell silent. No pen tapping, no chair shifting. They watched every line as though they were seeing, for the first time, the system they had depended on every quarter. I went on. I opened a folder of old emails, messages I had sent to human resources, to information technology, to operations directors. I read them aloud. Requests to train a successor, requests for contingency, planning, and requests to divide modules to ensure long-term stability. All of them had the same answer from former management: not a budget priority this year. I did not need to add commentary. The truth spoke for itself. But Connor did not yield so easily. When I closed the slide deck, he leaned forward, voice tight. You held power on purpose. You refused to share knowledge. This system is complicated because you made it that way. You made all of us dependent on you. I did not react. I simply opened another file. An email from Connor 3 weeks earlier telling me not to present too much detail about Helios Engine at the strategy meeting because he thought it would overwhelm others. An email from Human Resources 1 year ago said a successor was unnecessary because the analytics team was large enough. An email from the former chief financial officer thanking me for keeping the system running smoothly for 3 years without requiring training costs. I let them read each one. Then I looked directly at the board. I did not hold power, I held responsibility, and that responsibility was ignored for years. Connor had no response. His voice faltered. The chief executive officer stared at him longer than I expected, not with anger anymore, but with disappointment. I could see the moment he finally understood that Connor had not only made a mistake, he had dragged the entire company into a crisis that never needed to exist. When the discussion ended, the board delivered its conclusion clearly. The fault did not lie with me. It lay with the lack of vision, the lack of preparation, and the lack of listening in leadership. They turned toward me, and for the first time in 14 years, I felt genuine respect from the people who ran this company. Then I presented my conditions. One by one, no more, no less. I requested my role be restored, but not my old title. I wanted a new one, Chief Systems Architect. I requested full authority over the Helios engine. No intermediaries, no mid-level filters. I requested a dedicated support team for training and system maintenance, so no one could ever say I kept knowledge to myself. I requested to report directly to the chief executive officer. And finally, I requested compensation that reflected the true value of the work I did. No one objected. No one negotiated. No one asked a single question. They agreed because they had no other choice. But more importantly, they agreed because for the first time, they fully understood who they had underestimated all these years. The atmosphere in the boardroom shifted the moment I finished presenting my conditions. It was as if everyone could finally see a scale settling back to its rightful balance. But for Connor, it was the moment everything collapsed. He began talking fast, voice rising past what the situation required. His fists clenched so tightly the knuckles turned white. He tried to convince the board he only needed more time, that the issue was not that serious, and that with 24 more hours, he could work with information technology to restore the data. But no one believed him anymore. A board member pushed a thick folder across the table and opened it for everyone to see. His voice was low and firm as he read each figure aloud, like reciting charges. The $180 million contract was frozen. The $400 million merger could collapse without the quarter-ahead forecast. Two major partners had issued warnings about potential legal action for data breach. Connor froze. There was no explanation capable of covering that level of damage. The board asked legal to present supporting evidence. Legal opened a laptop and projected the logs the system had recorded over the past 4 days. Unauthorized override attempt, 6 times. Manual forecast, overwrite detected. Legacy data, alert deletion attempt, forced by the chief financial officer's instruction. I watched each line appear. Not the first time I had seen them, but the first time they surfaced before the entire board, people who had never witnessed the hidden cost of bad leadership. Legal pointed at each entry, explaining calmly. He attempted 6 overrides. He manually replaced current forecasts with old data to mislead the board. He ordered information technology to delete alerts and threatened them when they refused. The room went silent. A long, heavy silence, sharp and undeniable. Connor looked around, panic in his eyes, like a drowning man searching for anything to hold on to. He tried one last escape, blaming information technology. He claimed they had not cooperated, that they misunderstood his requests, that they exaggerated the risks. But this time, information technology did not remain quiet. The information technology director stood, voice calm but sharp enough to cut through every excuse. We refused to override again because doing so would erase 12 years of behavioral modeling. And if that happened, the Helios engine would become an empty spreadsheet. No one spoke after that. No one defended Connor. No one softened the blow. The most terrifying sound in a room full of powerful people is not shouting or accusations. It is the silence that follows when they have all reached the same conclusion. Connor sank into his chair, his face hollow, drained. Whatever words he tried to say came out in broken fragments. Finally, the chief executive officer rose. He straightened his tie, lifted his chin, and delivered the decision in a clear, unwavering voice, with no hesitation and no need for further explanation. Connor Drake is terminated effective immediately. No debate, no negotiation, no extension. One final decision. Connor looked around, stunned as if he could not believe what he had heard. But no one looked back at him. He stood, gathered a stack of documents that no longer held value, and walked out of the room. No one followed. No one said a word. The door closed behind him with a heavy thud, like a period marking the end of a career built more on arrogance than ability. I did not feel triumphant. There was no rush of victory, only a brief exhaustion, the feeling of finally setting down a weight I had carried in silence for years. I understood more clearly than ever that sometimes strength is not in raising your voice, but in staying quiet long enough for the truth to speak on its own. The chief executive officer returned to his seat. His expression had lost the strain of the previous days. He looked at me, for the first time with genuine respect. Ava, I want you to assess the system immediately. I nodded, but made it clear. Restoring the Helios engine would not be simple. It was not something that could be switched back on. I needed a team of engineers, full access rights, and cooperation from every relevant department. I needed time. The board confirmed in unison. You have full authority. You lead. You decide. I opened my laptop, feeling dozens of eyes on me. No more dismissal, no more doubt, no more seeing me as a silent asset in the background. I was the last person who could pull the company back from the edge they had created for themselves. The 30th floor boardroom was so quiet I could hear the projector fan turning softly. Everyone was watching me. No one spoke. No one even dared breathe too loudly. I opened my laptop, connected to the internal system, and began the authentication sequence only I could perform. I placed my finger on the biometric device. A thin wash of green light passed across the sensor. A faint ping sounded. The Helios engine responded instantly. Biometric authentication accepted. Primary architect identified. Ava Lindstrom. unlocking core security layers. Lines of code streamed across the screen like a massive machine waking up after a long sleep. I watched each protective layer open in sequence: behavioral tier, modeling tier, raw data tier, predictive AI tier. Every layer is activated with a sweep of green along the interface. I had seen this process hundreds of times, but never in a room full of people like this. Dashboard strategic loading, forecast module recalibrating, system status restored. The large screen at the end of the room lit up bright and clean. Familiar charts returned: cash flow data, market trends, consumer patterns, risk models, supply chain volatility. All of it flowed smoothly, precisely, exactly the way it always had. The entire room exhaled at once. One director sank back in his chair. Another rubbed his forehead as if escaping a nightmare. The information technology team behind me finally let their shoulders drop. The chief executive officer stood, not waiting for anyone. He spoke the moment the tension lifted. Ava Lindstrom is hereby appointed as the chief systems architect of Westbridge. His voice rang clearly, erasing every trace of chaos from the previous days. The board nodded. No objections, no hesitation, no doubt left about why I belonged in that role. I nodded slightly, not to mark a victory, but to accept the responsibility I had carried for years without the title to match it. Immediately after, the chief executive officer continued. I would have a dedicated support team: 4 data analysts, 2 security specialists, and a project manager. I would have a new office beside the executive suite. All Helios engine access belonged to me and my team. I would no longer report to any mid-level director. I would report directly to the chief executive officer. Hearing that felt like a weight finally loosening in my chest, not because of the authority, but because, at last, my work was being understood. A few minutes later, while the meeting paused for the final synchronization steps, I stepped out and called my mother. She was in her hospital room, her voice weak but warm. I told her everything was fine now, that I had a new position, that everything was shifting in a better direction. She didn't say much. She just smiled and told me not to worry about her. That alone lifted my shoulders more than anything had in weeks. When I returned to the hallway, a few people from finance and analytics hurried over to congratulate me. One said the entire company breathed again when the dashboard came back to life. Another said they still could not believe I had been fired just days earlier. All of them used a word I had never heard directed at me before: savior. I did not know how to answer, other than with a tired but genuine smile. Back inside the boardroom, I looked around at the place where I had once been dismissed, overlooked, and treated like a silent piece of machinery. And now every person in that room looked at me with a respect that carried no hesitation. And I realized something. Sometimes silence is not weakness. It is a weapon, a way to wait for the right moment, a form of resistance that needs no shouting, no spectacle. I closed my laptop and caught my reflection in the dark screen. They thought they could replace me, but without me, they could not function at all. And that is where the story ends, not as a victory, but as a reminder. Real value is not in how loudly you speak, but in what collapses when you are gone.